You can't do this.
I have my orders. This isn't right.
Please listen to us. We need to see him.
No visitors, he's in questioning.
This is outrageous. He has rights. Rules are rules.
You can't do this. We have our rights.
Ma'am, you need to disperse. Officer, we are within our rights.
You have no right.
Ma'am, step aside now. Officer, she has a right to be here.
Exactly.
Officer, we have our rights. I know, but we need to maintain order.
This is harassment.
Exactly!
Time has a way of revealing what moments cannot. The incident that began with a careless smile slowly matured into something far larger than pride. Harlem continued to move forward, but reputations, both fragile and fortified, were being quietly rewritten. The officer who once walked with sharp edges now carried himself with measured awareness. His posture no longer projected dominance, it reflected responsibility. He had come to understand that authority borrowed from a badge fades at the end of a shift, but authority built through conduct lingers in memory long after the uniform is folded away. At the center of this transformation remained Bumpy Johnson, whose influence operated less like a storm and more like gravity. He did not chase recognition, yet recognition followed him. He did not demand loyalty, yet loyalty gathered naturally around his consistency. Harlem respected him not because he was feared, but because he was predictable in his principles. When he gave his word, it held weight. When he chose silence, it carried meaning. When he corrected someone, it was done without spectacle. That reliability became his true currency. The officer began to see that his earlier insult had not damaged Bumpy's standing, it had only exposed his own immaturity. Reputation, he realized, is not destroyed by accusations alone, it is weakened by inconsistency. And Bumpy had remained consistent. He continued investing in youth programs, supporting small businesses, and guiding restless young men away from destructive paths. Even those who disagreed with aspects of his past acknowledged his discipline. That nuance unsettled the officer at first, but later it educated him. People are rarely one-dimensional, and leadership often exists within complexity. One afternoon, a heated disagreement erupted between two business owners over delivery routes. The tension threatened to escalate beyond words. Instead of asserting immediate control through force, the officer paused and requested both men step aside. He listened, he mediated, he referenced community agreements that had been previously established. His tone remained calm, deliberate, firm without humiliation. As the situation dissolved peacefully, he caught a subtle nod from Bumpy across the street. It was not approval in the dramatic sense, it was acknowledgement of growth. That nod meant more than any commendation from his superiors ever could. Reputation, he learned, is heavy. It must be carried carefully, reinforced daily, and protected through humility. The weight he once sought through intimidation had been hollow. The weight he now carried through restraint felt solid. Harlem noticed. Children no longer watched him cautiously, they greeted him by name. Elders spoke to him without guarded tones. He was no longer the officer who smiled at insult. He was becoming the officer who corrected himself. And in that correction, a deeper lesson unfolded. Strength does not require witnesses, it requires discipline. Growth, however, is never linear. Just when transformation feels complete, life introduces a test. One rainy evening, a rumor swept through Harlem, suggesting that a group of outside agitators planned to provoke unrest near a local jazz club. The atmosphere thickened with uncertainty. Patrol cars increased their presence. Whispers traveled quickly through doorways and storefronts. The officer, now more seasoned by reflection, felt the familiar pull of urgency, the temptation to overreact, to assert control loudly before chaos could form. Across the avenue stood Bumpy Johnson, observing the same tension with characteristic composure. He understood something crucial. Panic spreads faster than facts. If authority reacted aggressively, it would validate the rumor and escalate the environment. Instead, he walked calmly into the jazz club and addressed the patrons with measured assurance, encouraging them to remain steady and unified. His tone carried quiet authority, not alarm. Outside, the officer faced a decision. He could block the street, issue sharp commands, and project force, or he could apply the lesson he had learned months earlier. He chose the latter. He stationed officers at key points without creating spectacle. He spoke to business owners respectfully, clarifying that there was no verified threat. His communication was calm, transparent, grounded. The tension gradually dissolved as the night progressed uneventfully. The rumor faded without confrontation. Later, under the dim streetlight reflecting off wet pavement, the officer approached Bumpy once more. "I almost handled that differently," he admitted. "I almost let fear speak first." Bumpy regarded him steadily and replied, "The loudest reaction is rarely the strongest one." The officer nodded, recognizing how close he had come to repeating old patterns. Growth is proven not by avoiding mistakes entirely, but by interrupting them before they unfold. That evening became a defining memory, not because violence occurred, but because it didn't. Harlem remained intact. Businesses closed peacefully. Music drifted into the night air instead of sirens. The officer realized that leadership sometimes means preventing chaos rather than conquering it, and prevention requires patience. The smile that once symbolized arrogance had long disappeared. In its place stood intention. Years passed, and the story of that initial insult became less about confrontation and more about character. Harlem continued evolving, shaped by economic shifts, cultural movements, and generational change. Yet certain lessons endured, embedded quietly within its sidewalks. Among them was the understanding that dignity, once protected, multiplies. Bumpy Johnson remained a complex figure, respected for his discipline and strategic mind. He never publicly revisited the incident with the officer, because to him it was resolved the moment growth began. He believed that revenge diminishes both sides, but correction strengthens the entire structure. His leadership philosophy rested on one principle: control yourself before attempting to control anything else. The officer, now older and steadier, carried that lesson into every aspect of his work. He mentored younger recruits, teaching them that respect is not extracted, it is cultivated. He recounted, without naming names, the day he mistook ego for authority and learned that composure outlasts confrontation. His career advanced not through aggression, but through reliability. He became known not for dramatic arrests, but for stable neighborhoods. One quiet morning at sunrise, as Harlem's brownstones caught golden light, the officer encountered Bumpy on the sidewalk once more. There was no tension, no unresolved pride, just mutual acknowledgement shaped by time. "You taught me something," the officer said plainly. Bumpy adjusted his hat slightly and responded, "You chose to learn it." The exchange was simple but profound. Leadership cannot be forced upon someone unwilling to grow. The story of the vanished smile traveled through generations as a reminder that true power does not humiliate, it elevates. It does not erupt, it endures. Harlem remembered not the insult itself, but the transformation that followed. In the end, the lesson extended far beyond two men on a sidewalk. It became a testament to resilience, composure, and the quiet authority of self-discipline. Because when ego fades and humility takes its place, strength becomes something far greater than dominance. It becomes legacy.
Transformation rarely announces itself with fanfare. It reveals itself in consistency. The officer's gradual shift did not make headlines, but Harlem felt it. Where once there had been tension, there was now measured presence. Where once there had been performance, There was now attentiveness. He began volunteering at neighborhood events, initially out of obligation, later out of intention. He listened during community meetings rather than dominating them. Each adjustment, though small, accumulated into credibility. Respect began to return, not as fear, but as cautious acceptance. At the center of this evolution remained Bumpy Johnson, whose leadership operated less like a spotlight and more like a foundation. He understood that real influence extends beyond personal pride. He could have amplified the insult, rallied supporters, demonstrated dominance. Instead, he chose elevation. He believed that if a man is corrected publicly, resentment grows. If he is corrected privately, character has room to breathe. That philosophy shaped Harlem's stability in ways statistics could never measure. One evening, during a large neighborhood gathering celebrating a youth scholarship initiative funded anonymously by Bumpy, the officer stood at the edge of the crowd. He observed the applause, the gratitude, the quiet pride of families whose children would now attend schools they once only imagined. The officer realized that power built through fear would never produce this atmosphere. Fear isolates, service unites. The distinction became clear in the warmth of that evening air. He felt not excluded, but invited to improve. Later, as dusk settled and lantern lights flickered across the street, the officer approached Bumpy again. There was no tension in his posture this time. "You could have made me an enemy," he admitted honestly. "Why didn't you?" Bumpy studied him thoughtfully before answering. "Because enemies are easy to create," he said. "Leaders are harder." The simplicity of the statement carried profound weight. Leadership, Bumpy believed, meant strengthening even those who once opposed you, provided they were willing to grow. The officer reflected on how close he had come to defining himself by ego. His smile that day had not represented authority, it had exposed insecurity. In contrast, Bumpy's composure had revealed something far more durable, self-mastery. And self-mastery, he now understood, commands deeper respect than intimidation ever could. He began mentoring younger officers, advising them to temper confidence with humility. The lesson he had learned on that Harlem sidewalk became part of his own guidance to others. For Mamie, the incident faded into memory, not because it lacked significance, but because it had served its purpose. She continued walking through Harlem with the same grace as before, her dignity intact. The insult had not diminished her, it had illuminated the character of those involved. And in that illumination, growth had occurred. The officer no longer met her presence with arrogance. Instead, he offered respectful acknowledgement. No words were exchanged, yet mutual understanding replaced past tension. Harlem itself evolved through the lesson. Community gatherings grew more collaborative. Police presence became less adversarial. Young men who once viewed authority solely as opposition began to see nuance. None of this transformation was dramatic, yet it was meaningful. It proved that strength expressed through restraint can alter environments more effectively than force expressed through dominance. Years later, the story of the smile would still circulate, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in composure. People would say that a careless insult once echoed across Lenox Avenue, but it dissolved under the weight of dignity. They would say that the smile never returned, not because it was stolen, but because it was replaced by understanding. And they would remember that leadership is revealed not in moments of provocation, but in responses to it. In the end, the most powerful act was not confrontation, it was control. Not control over others, but control over self. That is what separated noise from authority, ego from legacy. And that is why the lesson endured. When you anchor yourself in discipline and purpose, even disrespect becomes an opportunity to elevate. The officer's smile vanished quietly, but in its place grew something far more valuable, a deeper awareness of what true strength looks like. Harlem did not need spectacle to remember the moment. It needed only the example that followed. The weeks that followed did not explode into confrontation. They unfolded slowly, like a storm deciding whether to break or pass. Harlem was observant, and observation can be more powerful than accusation. The young officer began to sense a shift he could not name. Conversations quieted when he approached, but not out of fear, out of choice. Shopkeepers answered his questions with professional courtesy, yet withheld warmth. Children who once scattered at the sight of the uniform now simply continued playing, glancing at him with neutral curiosity rather than intimidation. It unsettled him more than open hostility ever could. Authority without influence is like a badge without weight, and he felt lighter each day, not stronger. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson continued his routine with disciplined consistency. He woke early, read for an hour before the city stirred, and reviewed community matters with the calm of a strategist who understood that legacy is built in increments, not eruptions. He visited elders who remembered Harlem before the headlines. He funded youth boxing programs to channel restless energy into structured growth. He met with local pastors to coordinate food drives. None of these acts were publicized, none required applause. They were investments in stability. He understood that reputation built through intimidation fractures easily, but reputation built through service becomes infrastructure. The officer, however, carried a private agitation that grew heavier with each passing day. At first, he dismissed the discomfort as paranoia. Then he blamed the neighborhood's loyalty to Bumpy. Eventually, he was forced to confront something more difficult, the possibility that he had misjudged the man entirely. He had expected retaliation, confrontation, perhaps even a calculated show of dominance. Instead, he had received acknowledgement, a single calm nod that carried neither threat nor submission. That restraint unsettled him because it exposed his own immaturity. He had mistaken provocation for strength and composure for weakness. Now the mirror of silence reflected back something he didn't like. One humid evening, rain began to fall over Lenox Avenue, washing the sidewalks in silver reflections. The officer took shelter beneath an awning, watching as people hurried past. Across the street, he saw Bumpy exiting a church after a late meeting. There were no bodyguards surrounding him, no dramatic entourage, just a man adjusting his hat against the rain. A young boy tripped on the slick pavement nearby, scattering books across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Bumpy stepped forward, helped the child gather the pages, and spoke quietly to him. The officer could not hear the words, but he saw the boy's shoulders straighten afterward, as though given something invisible yet valuable. The scene lasted less than a minute, but it lingered far longer in the officer's mind. That night, sleep evaded him. He replayed the insult again, this time focusing not on his own smirk, but on Mame's composure. Her response had not been defensive, it had been instructional. A uniform does not give you permission to forget your manners. The sentence felt heavier now. He had joined the force believing he would bring order, justice, structure. Somewhere along the way, ego had quietly replaced purpose. The smile he once wore confidently now felt like evidence of insecurity. He began to realize that discipline without humility becomes arrogance, and arrogance erodes credibility. Days later, an incident forced confrontation with his own conscience. A dispute broke out between two young men near a cafe. The officer arrived first, ready to assert control through volume. Before he could escalate the situation, Bumpy stepped into the frame, not interfering, but observing. Instead of shouting, Bumpy addressed the young men calmly, reminding them of consequences that extended beyond the moment. His tone was firm but measured. The tension dissolved not because of fear, but because of respect. The officer watched, recognizing a skill he had not cultivated, influence without force. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, not rivalry, but recognition. Harlem's streets became classrooms, and the officer became an unwilling student. He noticed how Bumpy listened more than he spoke. He noticed how disagreements were handled with patience before power. He noticed how loyalty was earned through reliability, not intimidation. Each observation chipped away at the simplistic narrative he had built in his mind. The world was not divided neatly into authority and opposition. It was layered with nuance, responsibility, and moral complexity. He began to understand that leadership is not declared, it is demonstrated daily through restraint and accountability. One afternoon, unable to ignore the wait any longer, the officer approached Bumpy directly. There was no audience, no spectacle, just two men standing on opposite sides of a narrow Harlem sidewalk. The officer removed his hat, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement. "About that day," he began, voice steadier than he felt, "I crossed a line." The words were not dramatic, yet they carried significance. Bumpy regarded him quietly, eyes thoughtful rather than accusatory. "Respect," Bumpy replied calmly, "isn't something you demand from people, it's something you protect in yourself." The statement lingered in the air, not as a rebuke, but as guidance. The officer nodded. The apology did not erase the insult, but it marked a turning point. He walked away without the smile that once defined his arrogance. In its place was something quieter, reflection. Harlem noticed the change, subtle though it was. His tone softened, his patrols became less theatrical. He began addressing residents by name. Trust does not rebuild overnight, but effort plants seeds. And Bumpy, he did not celebrate the moment, nor did he publicize it. For him, victory was never about humiliation, it was about correction. He understood that transformation, even in an adversary, strengthens the entire community. The smile had disappeared, not because it was forced away, but because it had been replaced with understanding. Silence had done what confrontation never could. It had revealed truth without violence, and it had invited growth without spectacle.
Harlem in the late 1940s moved to its own rhythm. The sidewalks carried stories in every step, and the brownstones held more history than the city records ever could. On summer evenings, when the sun melted into a golden haze above Lenox Avenue, the neighborhood felt like a living heartbeat, steady, resilient, unbreakable. At the center of that heartbeat stood Bumpy Johnson. To some, he was a legend whispered about in barber shops and jazz clubs. To others, he was a man of quiet discipline who believed that real power didn't need to shout. But at home, behind the polished door of a modest brownstone, he was simply a husband. His wife, Mamie, carried herself with grace that couldn't be purchased and dignity that couldn't be shaken. She walked through Harlem with her head high, not because of fear or reputation, but because she understood something deeper. Respect starts from within. One afternoon, the air was thick with heat and tension. Patrol cars rolled slower than usual. Officers lingered on corners, scanning faces as if suspicion floated in the humidity. A young police officer, new to the neighborhood, eager to prove himself, stood near the curb, twirling his baton with careless arrogance. He had heard the stories about Bumpy Johnson. To him, they were exaggerated myths. When Mamie stepped onto the sidewalk, dressed in soft cream linen, carrying herself with calm elegance, the officer's smirk widened. He recognized her instantly. He stepped forward. "Well, look who we have here," he said loudly enough for passers-by to hear. "Mrs. Johnson. Must be nice living off complicated money." The comment hung in the air like smoke. A few pedestrians slowed their pace. Some looked down. Others watched carefully. Mamie did not flinch. She met his eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling, composure. "Officer," she said softly, "a uniform does not give you permission to forget your manners." Her voice was measured, steady, unshaken. The officer chuckled. "Just doing my job, ma'am." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that believed it had won. He didn't know that Harlem was watching. and Harlem remembered everything. That evening, word traveled, not through shouting, not through threats, but through quiet conversation, in jazz lounges, in barber chairs, across dinner tables. No one exaggerated what happened. They didn't need to. Bumpy Johnson heard the story not with explosive anger, but with silence. He sat at the dining table, hands folded, listening as Mamie recounted the moment with simple clarity. He smiled, she said, like it was nothing. Bumpy leaned back slowly. The room felt heavier, not because of rage, but because of disappointment. Disrespect was common in Harlem, but public humiliation, that crossed a different line. He did not slam his fist. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he asked one question. "Did you lose your composure?" Mamie shook her head. "No." A faint nod. "Then we haven't lost anything." That was the difference between noise and power. The young officer believed authority lived in volume. Bumpy understood that authority lived in restraint. But restraint was not weakness, and smiles sometimes were temporary. Over the next few days, something subtle shifted. Business owners who once cooperated freely with that officer began responding with polite distance. Information dried up. Conversations ended quicker than usual. Doors closed gently, not aggressively, but deliberately. The officer felt it, though he couldn't explain it. His smile grew thinner. He attempted to reassert dominance with louder commands, longer patrols, more visible presence. But respect cannot be forced. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson did something unexpected. He attended church. He walked through Harlem's streets, greeting elders, shaking hands, offering quiet encouragement to young men tempted by reckless paths. He funded a local literacy program anonymously. He covered medical bills for a struggling family without seeking recognition. He built reputation not through intimidation, but through consistency. And slowly, the comparison became obvious. One man wore a badge, the other wore responsibility. The officer's earlier smile began to feel heavier, because now, when he walked the street, people didn't look away in fear. They looked through him. One afternoon, he saw Bumpy standing outside a bookstore, speaking calmly to a group of teenagers about discipline. The officer hesitated. There was no crowd, no spectacle, just a man teaching young boys that respect must be earned daily. Their eyes met. Bumpy nodded once, calm, unbothered. No challenge, no threat, just acknowledgement. And something inside the officer shifted, because for the first time he realized something unsettling. The most powerful man in the neighborhood had not retaliated, he had elevated. And that made the earlier insult look small, petty, embarrassing. Weeks passed. The officer's reputation weakened, not because of formal complaints, not because of punishment, but because respect had quietly withdrawn. And in Harlem, reputation was currency. Without it, authority felt hollow. One evening, during a community gathering, the officer attempted to regain control by interrupting a peaceful event. His tone was sharper than necessary. Before tension could rise, Bumpy stepped forward, not aggressively, but calmly. "Officer, this is a permitted event. You're welcome to observe. You're not welcome to disrupt." The words were firm, clear, no shouting. The crowd remained calm. The officer opened his mouth to respond, then paused. Because in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. Power isn't proven by who you can belittle. It's proven by who you refuse to become. He lowered his baton. The smile never returned. That night, alone in his apartment, the officer replayed the sidewalk incident. He realized that his smirk had not shown strength, it had revealed insecurity. And Bumpy's silence, that had been strategy. But deeper than strategy, it had been character. Harlem continued to breathe. Life moved forward. But the lesson lingered like summer heat on brownstone steps. Disrespect might win a moment. Dignity wins the neighborhood. And sometimes the loudest revenge is living well enough that the insult becomes irrelevant. The officer learned that day what many never understand. When you insult someone grounded in purpose, you only expose your own instability. Bumpy Johnson never needed to make the officer stop smiling. The truth did that on its own.